Shane Malloy is the host of Hockey Prospect Radio, joining us on Winnipeg Sports Talk. You can hear Hockey Prospect Radio on the weekends over on Sirius XM NHL Radio. The Jets are going to be picking at 18. What do you think the level of prospect will be in the middle of the first round, where the Jets will be expected to be on the clock?
It's going to be very interesting because we don't quite know where the defensemen are going to go. And because there's not a lot of high-end defensemen, there's not maybe 3 or 4 number 3s in that group. Do teams take those defensemen because they want a defenseman a little bit earlier than probably they should be slotted? So it does one of two things. Either A, 2 or 3 teams take defensemen and some forwards fall to Winnipeg, or they take the forwards and the defensemen fall to Winnipeg. Either way, I think they're in a really good spot at 18. So you're sort of looking at, could David Reinbacher be there? That's a potential. Could Danielson be there? That's a potential. Could one or both of the Russian defensemen in Mikhail Gurianov, and then will those Russian defensemen be there in that respect? So that's going to be really interesting for Winnipeg. Will Matthew Wood slide down there? Samuel Honzek be there for them? Because I'm trying to I also look at the style of player that the Winnipeg Jets tend to draft. If you have the same scouting group together for a long time, they always leave breadcrumbs and tendencies of the style of player, what they're looking for. It's always there, right? So you can see when Winnipeg drafts, you go, okay, that makes sense. I understand why they took Perfetti, right? There are attributes about those players that are coveted. So I think there's about 5 or 6 players in there I'm sure they'd be chomping at the bit to get at if they could. So we'll see how that sort of all plays out in the draft, because it always takes 1 or 2 teams to really screw up the order.
Well, there's no doubt about that. You mentioned the Jets scouting staff. I mean, you've been in this game for a long time. If you had to evaluate the Jets as a scouting team, drafting and then developing, what grade would you give them, Shane?
Well, I have actually. So I have approximately over 300 pages of quant on every NHL team's drafting development success, every round, every region, forward, defense, goalie. So I've broken it all down. So I know how good everybody is from a quantitative standpoint. And the Winnipeg Jets are in the top 8. They're in the top 8. Now, you have to look at it from 2011 on. And I always give every team at least 5 years before I start evaluating their draft class. And I have different, markers of what my criteria is initially. So it's 200 plus games in the NHL, and then I wait till draft plus 5. I built that model back in 2007, and it's been adopted by a bunch of other people because it's based on behavioral economics and cognitive performance for the frontal lobe developing. And the Jets are 8th in that time frame. They do a very good job, and they actually, over time, depending on what happens with Harkins and another player, they could actually be even higher. They could push themselves into the top 5 realm, which is exceptional.
Who's the best?
The best, actually, this may surprise you, is the Pittsburgh Penguins. From 2006 to 2011, and then 2011 to 2015, they're the number 1. Now, it's amazing. I'll tell you, really,
they seem to never have their first round pick for the last.
And they draft late. Here's a crazy thing about Pittsburgh, and I had conversations with Randy Sexton, Jay Heinbach, and Tom Fitzgerald, because he was there, and as well as Bill Guerin when they were working in that department. So from 2011 to 2015, the Pittsburgh Penguins had 11 picks in the first 3 rounds. Guess how many of those 11 players went on to play 200 games or more?
6.
11.
What?
All of them.
That never happens.
No, honestly, I thought it was wrong. I went back and had to redo it 3 times, but it's fact. And the league average is about 46%. So they more than doubled the league average. It was phenomenal. But what it tells you is specifically targeting certain attributes in players, but most importantly, being very patient in their development. And I know, some Winnipeg fans or sometimes the media get on Chevy and Zinger for being really overtly conservative and patient, but they do it for a reason when it comes to prospects, because the majority of prospects are not ready until 5 years. Draft plus 5 there's a reason for that. It's a reason why the average age of a rookie forward is 22.9 years of age. It's not a fluke, and science backs it up. Cognitive science backs it up for that. So you have to let your guys develop. And I thought it was one of the smartest moves they ever made in putting their farm system in Winnipeg. Because then you have the collective group of all their player development, all their management, coaching staffs, everybody's in the same room. I think all NHL teams should do that if they can.
Well, forgive me for getting too far ahead of ourselves, and we'll give them a few more years. But I had the opportunity to just have a chat with Jimmy Roy at a Moose game when he was back in town about a month ago. And I was always interested to see how the season's going. I mean, the players that he's meeting with and talking about. And I mean, you could tell how excited he was and the organization was about the young men that they picked in last year's draft. We'll get to Brad Lambert and maybe the dub final in a second, but Rutger McGroarty, Elias Salmonson really stood out. I mean, obviously, I didn't know a lot about him. He's playing over in Europe. They were raving about him, Zhilkin, and then the goaltender, Dom DiVincentis. From your perspective, how much potential does the 2022 draft class of the Winnipeg Jets have? Not this year, but in the next few.
In 5 years, 5 or 6 years, or say 5 to 7 years, because you got to let the goaltender have a little bit of more leeway. They put in a normal year, if an NHL team can get 2 players to play more than 200 games, that's a really highly successful draft. Those teams who do that consistently are going to be contending teams. And I think Winnipeg could have 3, maybe 4. Could have 4 players in that draft class play more than 200 games, which is why Jimmy's so excited. And when we had him on our show, that was the same conversation. Like, you could see his eyes light up. And that doesn't happen very often with, development guys, because they know they have to be patient. But he was pretty fired up from that standpoint. And, if people want to listen, they can go back. Our shows are on podcast, so they're on any of the podcast network as well. And we have a YouTube channel. So you want to go back and listen to those 2 segments with Jimmy. I thought they were really enlightening in terms of what he thought, because he's not a guy he's not a rah-rah guy, right? Like, he's not going to sell you something that isn't true. That's just not who he is.
No, I've known Jimmy for a long time, and that's what stood out in the conversation. I mean, this was considered, listen, there was always optimism. We'll see. But, I mean, there was legitimate excitement.
Like yeah. There's not like that. And he doesn't blow smoke, and he's very pragmatic because he's been in the game a long time. And I think that's one of the things that sort of stood out to me. I was kind of like, And I actually went back and listened to the audio again and went back and watched the video again just to sort of like, oh, interesting. From that standpoint, because it was just something that I hadn't heard out of him before.
Shane, while we're talking about Jet draft picks, the Jets were able to sign Nikita Chibrikov, who was 50th overall, second in the 2021 draft. He showed up in Winnipeg, was with the Moose just at the end of their AHL season, but he'll be here in Winnipeg next year. Russian prospects a little harder to get much of a gauge on. I know you've got a good one. Tell us about the background, what you think about this player, and what sort of a young man is going to be coming to Winnipeg next season.
I had him in the late first round of my list because I thought his hockey sense and puck skills and ability to create time and space for himself and his line mates, and he has some deceptive ability. I thought his shot is really deceptive, and he's a guy that I think has the potential to play on a second line in the NHL. I do. Where he slots in, I think it was really good of him to come into Winnipeg and get a sense of what the American Hockey League is like, because there's always going to be some adjustment periods. It's really important for the European players to get what we call that cup of coffee at the end of the year. And hopefully he stays in Winnipeg the whole offseason and trains with their people, and then runs into a full season of the American Hockey League, because it'll make a huge difference in terms of, what he looks like in his first 20 games. But high offensive upside, like a very creative offensive player, and you can never get enough of those guys.